Hello everybody, good morning. This is Jordan Tremaine with All the Things, back with another book review, and today I'm finally finishing what I started a long time ago when I initially got interested in this story, and I'm glad to be bringing you this book review after a long time. So this has been one of my favorite stories of all time, and I'm glad that I read these books. I've done some reviews on other books in this universe, and I'm going to wrap it up right now. The book I'm talking about, or the series of books that I'm talking about, is none other than J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Okay, so I have been a fan of The Lord of the Rings like since high school, and I've been out of high school for a long time, but I've played a bunch of the video games, I've watched the movies, I've watched the extended movies, I've watched The Hobbit. There's even, there's a Hobbit live action that came out recently that has, it's a trilogy, and it's okay, and then there's a cartoon version from a long time ago that I think is much better, where Bilbo's kind of chubby. And I've watched that. And I've read The Hobbit, the book. I did a book review on that. I've read The Silmarillion, the book. I did a book review on that if you want to go check those out. The Silmarillion is such a good book. I highly recommend you read that if you're interested in The Lord of the Rings. And now I have read The Lord of the Rings. I know The Lord of the Rings came out in 3 volumes, which is The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. As I was reading these books, it really didn't make sense to me, or it didn't feel right to do 3 different book reviews, because they're one story just cut up into 3 parts. They don't, if you read them all together, there's no stopping point where oh, this is one story, this is another story, this is another story. I know there's stages like that, but it feels more like one story. So I read all 3, and I'm doing a review on all 3 right now. Just so you know, and so you're not confused, oh, which one is he talking about? I do definitely recommend that you read The Hobbit first if you're going to read The Lord of the Rings. And if you're somebody that watched the movies and really liked the movies, I think that you should read the book, because it is way different. It is way different than the story. The movie itself is a great story. It's a great movie. I love those movies. The extended editions, they have a lot of extra really good stuff, and I really appreciate them, even though they're super long. But I think they're great movies. But the books have a lot of different content. The storyline is actually very different, because for the movie they have to compress the story and switch some stuff around to make it a 2-hour movie or a 4-hour extended version. But in the book you just tell the whole story. So it turns out a lot different. And I was very surprised that the movie was so different than the book. That character's not even in the book, or that never happened. That person didn't say that. This person said that. And it was kind of weird to kind of have the movie in my head, have the extended version of the movie in my head, and then read the book. But I really did appreciate that, because if you're into history at all, history is very like that, where depending on who's telling the story is different, and the different perspectives make different details more important, or stuff happen that didn't happen in other stories. And it really felt like being a historian and having to piece together the different interpretations, like the director's interpretation and the author's interpretation. So I did appreciate that, but I do want to emphasize that if this is a good story to you and you've only seen the movies, I highly recommend reading the books. So the story of The Lord of the Rings is this story of these hobbits that they get this family heirloom passed down, which ends up being this amazing artifact of all power, and then they go on this quest to destroy it to save the world, and they get help from all these other elves and dwarfs and wizards and humans and all that kind of stuff. And I'm pretty sure this story is really well known, so I'm not going to get too much into the storyline, because you can go watch the movies or you can read the books yourself, which I highly recommend. But the thing that I thought was so interesting about this is what the movie doesn't tell you is, in the book there's a couple of extra sections where there's a section on the history of hobbits, and it talks about the history of the Shire and the hobbits' culture and all that kind of stuff, and it helps give you this feel of how the hobbits think and who they are. And It changes the interactions in the context of the book a little bit because you can be more in their shoes. So that's really interesting. At the end of the book, it gives a history of the men of Rohan and the men of Gondor and some of the Numenorian stuff. If you've read the Silmarillion, so there's extra content in this book that provides extra flavor and extra background to the story of the Lord of the Rings that I thought was really interesting. And then also there's just stuff that was not even brought up at all, even in the extended version of the movie. Like at the end of the book, after the hobbits go back to the Shire, a bunch of stuff happens. I'm not going to talk about it because I think you should read the book. But I'm like reading through it, and I'm like, there wasn't even a hint of any of this stuff inside the movie. And I get that because the movie's long enough. But the book is so significantly different than the movie. Things like, there's certain characters that exist in the book that don't exist in the movie. Certain people say certain things, or things happen in a different way that ultimately get you to the same ending, but in a different way that I think makes the story very different. I felt like the book version of the story was actually a completely different story, and it gave me a completely different feel. And what I loved about the book version of the story is, even though we're talking about like dwarfs and elves and hobbits and a bunch of things that are not human, the experience of all of these characters felt way more human to me reading the book than watching the movie. I know they were humans, they had human experiences, they had their trials and tribulations and their love stories and stuff inside the movie, but in the book, people made their mistakes, people had their dark sides, and people loved each other, and people treated each other in different ways that seemed way more human and way more realistic. And some of it was kind of cringy, and it was like, ugh, maybe you shouldn't do that, or oh, I can see why you did that, or oh man, that's so sad that you got put in that position and even had to make that decision. But I do appreciate a lot that the book helped color people as humans, even the bad people. It showed some of the background as to why they got into that position or how they became that person that ended up making that decision. And to me, that really makes a story where you can put you can put yourself in almost any character's shoes and be like, I don't know if I would have done better. I don't know if I would have made a different decision. From his perspective, maybe he thought he was the good guy. From his perspective, maybe he thought that was the right thing. From his perspective, he was being tricked, so he didn't know that this was bad. Or even if he knew it was bad, like, there was so much pressure on him, or there was so much force trying to push him in that direction. Could I have withstood that? Could I have been strong enough? Because I think a lot of times when we look at other people, or we look at things that have happened, we like to say, I would have done better, or I would never do that, or how bad for that person. But the way this story is written, I feel like it humanizes very deeply the characters, even the non-human characters, like especially the hobbits, where they don't have all good qualities. Like Pippin, he'd be making mistakes all the time. And he's still part of the family. He's still part of the group. And he ends up doing well, and he learns from what he does, and he ends up doing a lot of good stuff. Frodo, he has a heavy burden to carry, and he doesn't act nice all the time. But sometimes that happens when you have a heavy burden to carry. And it's good to be patient with people, and Frodo recognizes that, and he apologizes for it, and he tries to be good. But he slips up, and that happens. And he's the main hero of the story, but even he needs help. Even he slips up. And I think that's so great to have characters that are realistic, that are not all good, and don't make great, excellent decisions 100% of the time, because nobody does that. And they have consequences in the book, and I think that's great. Like, one of the main things in The Return of the King is Pippin, like I said before, he'd be doing all sorts of stuff. He makes a huge mistake, and it really changes the dynamic of the book. And maybe it's not a mistake, he just does something. And that's just who he is. And he has to pay for it, and that's what happens, and it becomes a big part of the story. And I think, like, as far as telling a story that's realistic or telling a story that's good, it has to, like, connect with humans on some level, because humans are the ones reading it. And I really appreciate that J.R.R. Tolkien was able to do that, even with the elf characters and the dwarf characters and Gollum and the wizards and all these different characters, even the orcs. He humanized them too, and like they had feelings, they had stuff they wanted to do, and they didn't. Not all of them wanted to be in the war, and they weren't just these evil, one-dimensional things that were like, oh, just kill them, they're evil, we don't need to talk to them, blah 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 blah. And that's, I think, a really crucial part of a good story. If the story is like, you're good, you're bad, I don't want to hear anything bad that the good person did, or anything good that the bad person did, or any sort of like depth to the character. I mean, sometimes it makes us feel good, but I really appreciate that this story was able to capture that human element, or that realistic element where people make mistakes and people are able to learn from them or not, or grow for them or not, and there's consequences for your actions. So this is still like, I think this is still one of my favorite stories of all time. And it continues to get more interesting as I find more content. The thing that I have to do now, I learned that I guess during the Cold War, the Soviet Union or the Russians, they made like a version, like a live action version of The Lord of the Rings that I got to check into, that I think might be interesting. But I like kind of go into the content and like to see the real story and the background and why things happen. That's kind of one of the things I'm really interested in. And so I'm glad that I finally finished this book series. Yeah, this is an excellent series of books. I think there's a reason why it's super famous. I think there's a reason why they made such high profile movies on it. And I would highly recommend this book. It's very different than the movies. And it's different in a way that makes the movie its own thing. So you can enjoy the movie separately, and you can enjoy the book separately, and you do both of them and have a good experience differently and still be surprised either way. So the book is, let me get this picture back up, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Like I said before, The Lord of the Rings is really 3 books. It's The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. But they're all the same story. They're 3 parts of the same story. It's a trilogy. So this book review is about all 3 of those books wrapped in one, because I read all of them at one time. Bam, bam, bam. It didn't feel right to do the review of the 3 separately. So I recommend those books. I think they're great, and I'm a huge fan of The Lord of the Rings. If you are too, drop something in the comments, like what's your favorite part of the book. I think from the movie, or like the favorite scene that I have is like the second breakfast thing, but I think that's like classic, iconic scene. But if you like it, let me know. If there's other Lord of the Rings content that you think is interesting, I tried to get into that like big old 25,000 page thing. I'm still trying to work up the courage to dive into that, like the expanded Silmarillion type of thing, but not there yet. But yeah, I am Jordan Tremaine, doing these book reviews for all the things. That's the name of this channel. This episode was on Lord of the Rings, and if you have other books, let me know. If you like this review, let me know. But regardless, I'm going to keep doing these reviews. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.